Hello, welcome to another video of Code Snippet. So this video is again a continuation of last video where we are looking into Spring Data JPA. So this is basically the part 3 of it. In the first part, we have seen the introduction. In the second part, we have seen JPA architecture and entity lifecycle. So in this video, we are actually going to write the code for it and we will actually see the implementation, how we can implement that. So this is going to be a fun video. So sit back, relax and enjoy the show. So let's quickly go through the agenda again. So here is basically the agenda. So in the first part of it, we have seen the introduction. In the introduction, we have seen what is JDBC, what is ORM, what is JPA. After that, we have seen the JPA architecture and entity lifecycle. So architecture of JPA we have seen, entity lifecycle we have seen. We have understood the internals of JPA. So if you remember over here, we have seen this particular architecture of JPA. We have understood what is entity manager factory, queries, transactions and persistence context, right? And if you see over here, we have seen this entity lifecycle as well, right? We have seen all the stages through which the entity will go through, right, in its lifecycle. So if you haven't watched this video, just go ahead and watch it. It's basically the prerequisite of this particular video. After that, in this video, we are going to jump into the implementation part of it, right? So we will see how to set up a project. So we are going to create an application management project, basically a job application management. After that, we'll add some entities. We'll see a few annotations which we need to add entities. After that, we will see 3 types of repositories provided by JPA, Crud repository, JPA and Paging and Sorting repository. After that, we will use some inbuilt methods in order to perform some Crud operations. That we will see what exactly is query methods, query annotations. All of these things we are going to look into this video, right? That is basically about the agenda of this particular video. Now let's jump to the implementation, right? So let's first set up the project, right? So in the last video, we have already saw that I have created this particular project, but how to create that? You can just go to start.spring.io. Here you can choose Maven. Here you can choose this version, which is by default selected. Here you can add the name of your application. So I have added application management system, right? So you can add same over here or whatever name you want to give, you can give. After that, here is a description. You can select jar from here. Java 17 is fine. And you need to add few dependencies, right? So for example, we are going to add few REST APIs. So we need Spring Web, right? So Spring Web is something which you can add. After that, we are going to use JPA. So Spring Data JPA you need to add. After that, we need a database, right? So we will use some in-memory database for now. You can use any database. I'm using H2 over here because it's easy to set up, right? Now, once you do that, you just need to generate a project from here and it will download a zip file for you. You need to unzip and open it in IntelliJ or whatever editor you want, right? It will have something like this. So if you see over here, it will just have this application file, right? Application management system application, which will be annotated with @Spring Boot application. These folders are something which I have created. So controller, basically there is nothing inside controller, repositories and service. But I have created one entity, which is applicant, which we saw in the last video, right? So for the example purpose, I have created this, right? But we are going to modify it further. It's just a simple Java class, right? So what I'm going to do over here, I'm going to create few controllers and service. Now this boilerplate code, I'm going to create it and I'm going to explain as we have created it multiple times in the series. So just in order to save time, I will just add few files in the controller in the service and I will highlight what exactly I have done. All right, so I have added couple of files over here. So if you see over here, I have added this controller, applicant controller, right? So basically, first we are going to implement functionality specific to applicant, right? For example, a user who is going to apply for the job, right? So here I have added 2 controllers. Basically, first is a get mapping to get all the applicants, and second is basically to save the applicants, right? So basically a new applicant which we want to save inside our database, right? So that is basically the overall controller I have added. Simple stuff only. I haven't added any database or stuff yet. I have just created a boilerplate code, right? After that, we have created a service over here. In the service, I have 2 functions. First is get applicant and the second one is basically to save applicant, right? So save applicant Crud, right? So here I'm just taking applicant as an input, right? And for now, I'm just returning null, nothing specific. Here applicant service should ideally talk to your repository layer and store or get the data, right? So that is the implementation, which is the crux of this video, and we are going to actually implement that, right? First, what we are going to do, let's first add an applicant, right? So this is basically the entity for the applicant. So if you see over here, if I go to this canvas over here, so first step basically is to create entity when we want to create a JPA, right? These are basically the fields that we are going to add inside our database. Perhaps we can add one more. Let's say we add status, right? So what is the status of that particular application? That is something we can also add, right? So all these fields we have added. Now this is basically a simple Pojo class, right? Very, very simple class. This is not an entity yet. Now in order to convert this guy to entity, we need to make use of a annotation that is called as entity, right? So we need to add one annotation called as entity, which comes from persistence, right? So at the rate entity I will add over here. So once you add entity on top of this guy will be converted to entity, right? So whenever we create object, it will be actually treated as an entity, which will be a table inside your database. So you need to just add this entity and just forget, right? It will create a table with this particular name inside a database. Now every database needs a primary key, right? Every database needs a primary key. So let's say this long ID is going to be a primary key for us. So in order to define that, you need to make use of @ID annotation, right? So once you do that, this particular ID is going to be the primary key. Now we have seen two annotations over here, entity and ID, right? Now, whenever you create a new applicant, are you going to manage this ID on your own? Is user going to manage it? Do user care about this ID, right? This is something which is handled by our system, right? User do not care about that. If I am applying for job, why do I care about the ID that is going to saved in the system's database, right? So I'm not going to care. So our system should handle the auto generation of this particular ID, right? So that is when generated value comes into picture, right? So this is going to be a generated value, right? Now generated value needs a strategy, right? What is a strategy? Let's come back to it. So there are different type of strategies basically. So I'm selecting auto over here. So this generated value takes one argument, that is basically a strategy, and this generation type is basically enum, which pass that particular value. So here, if you see here, we have multiple generation types, right? So we have table, we have sequence, identity, UUID, auto, right? So we are making use of auto now, right? Now each persistence provider have its own way of creating this primary key, right? For example, Hibernate will have its own way. So basically, if you choose auto, then your persistence provider, or let's say Hibernate in this case, should pick up any one of these, right? You just select auto and let the other guy do whatever it wants to do, right? The UUID is basically a universally unique identifier, right? So that will be used for your primary key in this case. Identity means it should use identity column in order to provide the ID. Sequence means it should use database sequence in order to generate the primary key. And table means your persistence provider must assign a primary key for that particular entity using an underlying database table, right? So it says primary key for entity using an underlying database table to ensure uniqueness, right? So that is basically another generation type. So this is basically the generation type, right? So let's come back over here. So for now, what I'm doing, I'm selecting auto over here. Now this is a minimum thing that you need in order to use entities, right? There are many other things that you can use, but these are the minimum things, right? Now what we are going to do, let me just create few getter setters quickly. So what I will do, I'll go to generate and I will create getters and setters for everyone, right? So that will do that for me. So all the getters and setters are generated, right? So that is basically our entity. So we have successfully created the entity for us, right? So that is basically it about the entity. Let's go back over here to controller. Now what will happen over here? This guy will just return the list of applicant. Now first what we need to do, we need to save the applicant, right? So in order to do that, we need to accept the request body, right? So we will actually send the JSON when we call this particular REST API, post REST API, right? So this will have that detail will be sent to this function inside a service. And now the point comes when we actually want to define our repository. What we are going to do over here is we are actually going to save it to database at this stage and get it from database at this stage, right? So in order to do that, we need a repository. Now let's create a repository, right? So as at this moment, we are doing just a CRUD operations, right? So what I will do, I'll go to repositories, create a new Java class, name it as applicant CRUD repository. We need to extend this repository with CRUD repository, right? There we go. So basically we need to extend this repository with CRUD repository. So if we go back over here, as we have seen inside the agenda, So if you see, we have three type of repositories: Crud repository, JPA repository, and paging and sorting repository, right? So here we are implementing Crud repository. And if you go back over here to this diagram, then if you can see over here, Spring Data JPA is kind of an abstraction layer on top of JPA, right? So internally Spring Data JPA is going to use JPA only. But what this guy is doing, this is simplifying stuff for us. This is providing us interfaces or layer of abstraction to interact with JPA, right? So when we create this class, it should not be class, ideally it should be interface, because it's a abstraction, right? So that's why we will create an interface ideally, right? So this interface will extend this Crud repository, and this Crud repository will accept parameters, right? So here we need to pass parameters, right? So here first parameters would be what will be the entity, right? So our entity is basically an applicant, and the second parameter is what is the type of primary key of this particular applicant. So here if you go inside it, our primary key ID is basically this ID, and what is the type of that? A long type. So what we will do, we will just go back and add long over here, right? Now that's it basically. So that is the only thing you need to do in order to create applicant Crud repository, right? Very, very easy stuff, right? You don't even need to implement any methods. You don't need to write any code in order to do DB operations. That's how easy your Spring Data JPA is, right? Once you do that, what you need to do is you need to go inside your service and create the object of application Crud repository, right? So let me just import it. What I will do, I will just create a private variable. What I will do, I'll just use a field injection for now. So what I'll do, auto void, right? This is basically the dependency injection I'm talking about. If you're not sure what is the dependency injection, then I have already created a video on dependency injection in the same playlist. You can go ahead and check that. So now we have this Crud repository created already, right? Now what we are going to do over here, we need to save this applicant right now. So what we will do, we'll just say applicant Crud repository dot save. And what save method will take? Save method will take what applicant you want to save, right? And that is it. Now this statement should save it inside your database, right? Now what we will do, we'll just return that from here itself and remove this statement, because save will return the same entity applicant, and applicant will be sent back to your controller, right? And we can use this applicant Crud repository here as well. So what we will do here, applicant Crud repository dot find. We will do find all because we want everyone, right? Because we want the list of it. Now here if you see, this find all method is returning iterable, right? But if we want to return list, right? So we need to convert this all to list, right? So for that purpose, what I'm doing over here is I'm just creating a new array list, and I will just add each element to that particular array list by using a loop, right? So very, very simple stuff over here. We can use streams as well, but let's keep things simple over here, right? What I will do, I will just return applicant list from here. So that should return the list of applicants right back to our controller, right? So that is basically it, right? Apart from that, if you go here inside resources, then we have a few configurations added related to H2 database. So here we have added URL, we have added this driver class, we have added some username and password. We have added this to enable the console so that we will be able to see the database on the console, right? After that, we have added Hibernate DDL auto update so that Hibernate will be able to perform update operations. And we have added JPA show SQL so that we can see what SQL it is creating, right? In the console log output, right? So that is basically the configuration. Now I think we are at the stage when we can run this application, right? So what I will do, I will just go to this particular class and I will hit run from here. Let's see what happens. There we go. It seems that our application has started. So if you see over here, started application management system application in this much seconds, right? So now what we can do before doing any operations, let's just go to a browser and let me just open this particular console. So if you see over here, if you have H2 console enabled at this particular path, so what I will do, I will just load this URL and it should show something like this, right? This is basically the H2 console, right? So what I will do, I'll just maximize it or increase the size of it so that it is clearly visible, right? So now here you need to add driver class, JDBC URL and stuff, right? So driver is basically the same because we are using H2, but here the JDBC URL would be different because the name of our DB here is different, right? So that is something which you will find over here in the same log. You just need to copy it from here, go back to your browser and just paste it. And what username and password we added while we add configuration, let's go back and check. So SA and password, right? What I will do here, I will add SA and here I will add password, right? And I will say connect. So that should connect it, right? So that is basically how the console of H2 looks, right? We have seen this multiple times in this series. If you are following this series, you might be aware of this already. Now here, if you see, we have this table. We have this applicant table. We have this ID field, email, name, phone, status, everything we have, right? Did we write any code to create this? First of all, no, we did not. Who is creating it? Who is creating it? JPA is creating it, right? So if you go back over here in the architecture, then here, this entity is basically managed by this entity manager. Then some provider like Hibernate would have created a query and hit this query to create a DB table inside this database. Now let's see if we can check something like that in the logs, right? Now if you could see this, here it is making use of Hibernate, right? So it is actually writing a Hibernate query. If you see over here, this is a Hibernate query, create table applicant, and it is defining all the variables that we have inside our entity, right? It is defining a primary key as well, right? So everything it is doing for us. It is also doing sequence generation and everything, right? So it is taking care of everything from the database side. We don't need to do anything from our side, right? So here in this case, the provider is Hibernate. So Spring Data JPA is internally using JPA and JPA is internally using Hibernate as a provider to perform these database operations. Now probably you will be able to link that this entity is managed by entity manager and this particular transaction and query is created by Hibernate and that guy is creating your database, right? Now when we debug, we will actually see how your entity manager looks like. But for now, we have this particular table created with us and our application is up and running, right? So what we can do, we can try to add a few applicants now, right? Now let me just quickly create this particular API inside Postman. So if you see over here, I have added this particular URL, right? So URL and API/applicants I have added over here. So if you see over here, we have that in request mapping over here, API/applicant. And first we will add, so we need post mapping, right? In order to add it. So what I will do, I'll select post from here. So let's provide all these details that we have added from here, right? So if you see our entity, then we have name, email, phone, status, right? Then let's add this data. So basically let's give name as Pushpa and we have this email ID over here and we have some phone number and status is, let's say, active. I don't know why Pushpa is applying for a job, but let's say he needs a job. Pushpa means our Pushparaj, right? Which is becoming famous day by day. So let's add him, right? Now let me just hit this real quick. So if you see, we have got some response. That means Pushparaj applicant is added, right? Now let's add one more. So what is the other character from Pushpa, right? So let's add Konda Reddy, right? Konda Reddy again. Konda Reddy is again another character. Let's add. But as far as I remember, that guy is dead, right? In the part 1. But let it be, that guy might need a job in hell. So if I add it, as you can see, the ID2 again is added over here. So this ID we are not passing over here, right? So if you see carefully, this ID is something which we are not passing from here. So that is something which is generated automatically. As we have seen, we have added generation type over here, right? Generated value, generation type as auto, right? So that is basically, it is creating automatically for us. So now at this stage, if we go to our database, let me just reload this guy real quick and we need to connect it again, I believe. So if you see over here, this applicant, right? So what I will do, I'll just add some query like select star from applicant, right? Select, right? So let me just run this real quick. So if you see over here, we have our Pushparaj, we have our Konda Reddy, and both of these guys are added inside our database with status as active, right? So super, that means things are working out for us. Our JPA is working fine, right? Now we have added one more API, right? What API we have added? So if you go to controller, we have added this get all applicants, which will get the list of applicants for us from our service, and it will use CrudRepository to find everything and it will just return the list. Let's go back over here and let's try to hit the get API of it, right? So if I hit the get API, in this case, it is not going to use this JSON data. If I send it, it will just return us the list. So if you see over here, Pushparaj and Konda Reddy are returned over here in the list. That is basically read operations. We have create and read, we have already seen, right? That is working fine for us. Now if we go back over here, then do you see these queries over here? So if you see over here, we have this insert into applicant, which is inserting data for us. After that, we added one more, we added Konda Reddy. After that, we hit a select command, which is basically selecting stuff for us, right? Now what we will do, let's run this application in debug mode actually, and let's see what happens. So let me just start it in debug mode. I'll do from here, I can start in debug mode, stop and rerun. So the application is started. Now let's go ahead and add one more applicant over here, right? Before that, what I'm going to do is I am going to add a few debug points. So here in the controller, I will add one. No need to add it in controller. Basically, let's go to service and add basically, right? So here in the service, I will add one here, and we will actually go inside save and we will see what exactly is happening. So if you see over here, we have this save method inside CrudRepository interface, and if we go inside the implementation of it, then this is again provided by a JPA itself, right? So if you see over here, we have this entity manager object, right? So this is basically the entity manager object, right? So I've added a debug point over there. So if you remember in the last video, we have gone through JPA architecture, right? So entity is basically managed by your entity manager. So it's the same entity manager we are talking about here in this implementation, right? So let's see what happens in this case, right? So let's add one more applicant over here. This time, let's say we will add Shrivalli, right? So let's add Shrivalli. What is the surname of Shrivalli? Who knows? We are going to add this. So let me just hit send. It should wait for us in the debug mode. So we have added this debug point over here, right? Now if I proceed, then it will show the entity manager. So if you see over here, we have this entity manager object. If you go to here and try to check the definition of it, then you will be able to see that it's an entity manager, shared entity manager proxy for target factory, right? Just click on view. So you will be able to see that it's object of local container entity manager factory bean, right? So this is basically Spring internals, right? We don't need to go inside that. It's basically that this entity manager is being created for us. And if you see, we have this persistence provider, which is basically Hibernate, right? In this case, do you see over here that it's a Hibernate, right? So here basically it is going to persist the object as it is a new object, right? So it is internally using entity manager.persist. Now when we move forward, right, from here, the entity should actually be added inside our database, right? So if you go back over here, let me just refresh this real quick and let me just log in again. If you see over here in the applicant, we will just run it. So you see that there is one object. Now few people may have doubt that where is the other two. We have added Pushpa and Konda, right? As we have rerun our application, the data is basically vanished because H2 is in memory database and it will be reloaded each time you reload your application or restart your application, right? So if you want the data to persist, use something like MySQL, which will persist your data, right? Or keep the data inside your database, right? So that is basically how you can add the data and get the data by using JPA. In the similar way, you have multiple functions. So if I go inside any service and show you the functions, right? So let me just show you a real quick. So let's say applicant CrudRepository dot, then you will see that you will have save, you have find all, count, delete all by ID, right? So this is basically delete stuff. You have save all, find by ID, right? You have many functions over here which you can make use of from CrudRepository. So these functions are majorly for create, get, delete and update operations, right? So that is basically CrudRepository for you, and that is how you can implement it, right? Now, as we have seen in the agenda, so let me just go back over there. In the agenda, as we have seen, there are more types of repositories. So CrudRepositories is something which we have already seen. After that, we have Paging and Sorting repository, and after that we have JPA repository, right? So we have two more repositories to look into. So we have seen CrudRepository. We have seen that it performs Crud operation. Now what is different in these and these repository, right? So first, let's see the difference between all three, and then what we will do, we will just implement and see examples of Paging and Sorting and JPA repositories, right? Right. So if we go over here, then this is basically how we can visualize it, right? So basically first we have CrudRepository that we have seen. This repository over here provides a very basic Crud operations like create, read, update and delete kind of stuff, right? Very easy stuff. And this repository is basically very lightweight and suitable for your simple operations, right? You can go ahead and use this when you need to perform very simple operations inside your application, right? Then comes Paging and Sorting repository, right? So as the name suggests, this repository will give you some features related to paging and sorting, right? So what this repository will do, this will extend your Crud repository. That means this guy will have all the functions of your Crud repository plus few more functions related to paging and sorting, right? So we will look into that when we actually see the examples of it. After that, we have a JPA repository, right? So this comes from Spring Data JPA, right? Now this JPA repository extends paging and sorting repository. That means this will include the functions from both Crud repository and paging and sorting repository, along with few JPA specific functions. For example, we have flush method, right? In order to flush the data inside database, right? So after that, we have methods as save and flush, delete in batch. After that, this also supports something called as query methods, which is again a very important feature. So that is something we are going to look into as well, right? So that is basically how the Crud repository, paging and sorting repository and JPA repository are related and different from each other, right? Now, if I go back to document, then if you see over here, then we have these features, and for each feature we will see what Crud repository will provide, what paging and sorting, and what JPA will provide, right? So if we talk about basic Crud operations, then Crud repository will be able to provide that. As paging and sorting is extending Crud repository, so that guy also will be able to provide basic Crud operation, and so do JPA repository, right? So all three repositories will provide basic Crud operations, right? After something called as pagination comes into picture, then this guy won't be able to do it Crud repository, right? Because this guy will do only basic stuff. So pagination will be provided by paging and sorting repository and JPA repository. After that, sorting, same thing, right? This guy won't be able to do it, but both of these two will be able to do it, right? Then we have JPA specific methods, for example, flush. Then both Crud and paging and sorting will not be able to do, only JPA will be able to do, right? And we have custom query methods and batch operations, which will be only supported by your JPA repository, right? So this is how we can visualize it, how JPA repository is different from these two, and what exactly is difference between these three, right? So this is basically a famous interview question as well. People ask what are three type of repositories and what is the difference between them, right? So you know what to answer now, right? Now, as we have seen the differences between them, and we have also seen the example of Crud repository, let's go and implement paging and sorting repository now, right? So in the same way as we have created application Crud repository, let's create a new interface again and add this application paging and sorting repository. So that should do it for us. Now what we will do, we will extend with which one now? Paging and sorting repository, right? And we will add here our entity, which is basically applicant, right? Applicant, and the primary key is long, right? So that should do the job for us, right? Now let's create the object of this guy. Let's inject it inside our applicant service, right? So what I will do, I will just create an object of it, application paging and sorting repository, and I will just simply auto wire it, right? So for now I'm auto wiring it, but the best practice of dependency injection is basically doing a constructor injection, right? So again, dependency injection is something you can check in the other video where I have covered it in details, right? Now what we will do over here, we will implement a function. We will implement a function to get application with pagination, right? So here what we are going to do is we are going to implement this function get applicants with pagination, right? Now we want to paginate it. We want to say what exactly the size of page that we want over here, right? So what we are going to do over here is I will just say applicant paging and sorting repository dot find all, right? Find all, and we will need to create the object of page request over here, page request of page and basically page size and the size of elements on each page, right? So that is basically how we can implement paging, right? So what we are going to do over here, so we have implemented this function. Now let's quickly add a API for it over here. So this should basically do it, right? So I've just added a new API over here. What it will do, it will just call the service and say get application, and it will call our service function with this page and with this size, right? So page and size I have taken from user by using request parameter, right? So what we can do over here, let me just rerun this application, right? And let's try to run it quickly. So it failed. So there is some error. Basically we are not returning this. We should actually return this, right? So should not fail anymore. Looks like there is an extra bracket as well. So let me just try to run it now. Should work ideally. Yeah, it is working now. So what I will do, I will just go to our Postman and I will try to call our new API saying page, right? So here we need two request parameters now. First is page. Let's say we want one page over here, and size, let's say we want 2, right? So if we send this request now, right, it should not be post, it should be get ideally. So if I send this request now, then if you can see over here, so if you see the output over here, we have this content, right? And the content is empty now because we don't have much data inside our application. And it is again giving the object of pageable, that is the whatever the page size we want and what is the page number we want, right? Now let's first, before hitting this API, let's do one thing. Let's try to add some data inside our application. So what I will do, I'll just create a duplicate API over here. What I will do, I'll just add the same body over here in JSON format and I will post it, right? So let's see. So the data should be added. Let's add some more data. Let's add Pushpa Bhau, right? So Pushpa Bhau is also added. Let's add our other guy. What was it? Konda, right? Konda Reddy. Konda Reddy also added. There we go. Let's add one more. Let's add Konda's brother basically, right? So that also is added. Let's come back to our page API, right? So here we have used paging and sorting. So now if I request, so if you see over here, we are getting entries 3 and 4 when we say page number 1 and size as 2, right? So on page number 1, we have 2 entries, right? Konda Reddy and Jolly Reddy is coming over here, right? But basically page size start from 0, right? So if I add 0 over here, let me add 0 and send it. So our first 2 entries will be here, right? This is basically pagination that we are implementing. So on first page, we have these 2, right? On second page, that is page number 1, we have these 2 entries, right? If I increase the size to, let's say 3, right? Then on the first page, you will only have 1 entry, right? But on the 0th page, we will have 3 entries because size is now 3, right? So as you can see, we have 3 entries over here, 1, 2 and 3, right? Basically, that is how pagination is working, right? So on each page, how much data we want, that is something we are defining over here, right? So if I pass 4, then it will show all the entries on single page only. And when I pass first page now, it should be empty in this case, right? So that is basically how the pagination works. And all this thing is easily achievable by using paging and sorting repository that we are looking over here. So that is basically how you can implement it. Very, very simple, right? Right. So that is basically how we can implement paging and sorting repository, right? Now let's jump to a very, very important point over here, right? So now we have seen Crud repository and paging and sorting repository and its implementation, right? But let's come back over here. So this behavior that we are looking, that the one which I have just highlighted, that Crud repository extends paging and sorting repository and that guy extends JPA repository, is valid for older version of Spring Data. So at this moment also, if you go and Google this relationship between these two or the difference between these three, you will find that Crud repository extends paging and sorting repository and that guy extends JPA repository, right? But this behavior is not valid in the recent version of Spring Data, right? Now there are few modifications and new introductions in the new version of Spring Data. So what are those? Let's see. So if you see over here, in the new version of Spring Data, they are addressing a major issue that we also have faced over here. So if you remember, while doing a get operation from Crud repository, when we did find all, it returned us the iterable, right? But that is not something which we want. We want the list, right? We want this list. What we had to do, we had to convert that iterable to a list and then return, right? So this is a problem, right? This is basically the problem they are trying to address. So what they have done, they have introduced new repositories like list Crud repository and list paging and sorting repository, right? So if you go back over here, then the new implementation would look something like this, right? If you see over here, this is how it would look like. So at the top, you will have a repository. So this is basically the marker interface. This you will have here as well, right? So here also you will have that, right? So just a marker interface, it will not have any methods, right? So at the top, you will have repository. So if you go back over here and try to see this Crud repository and just go inside it, then you will see that it is extending a repository and which is kind of a marker interface that we have without any methods, right? So that is basically your repository at the top. Then Crud repository will extend repository and paging and sorting repository will again extend repository. Now, major point to notice over here is that your paging and sorting repository is not extending Crud repository in this case, right? So the behavior that we saw over here, that Crud repository was extending paging and sorting repository, is not valid anymore, right? Here paging and sorting repository does not extend Crud repository, right? Here they have introduced two new things, right? List Crud repository and list paging and sorting repository, right? And our JPA guy will now extend both of these, list Crud repository and list paging and sorting repository, because it needs method from both Crud repository and paging and sorting repository. So it had to extend both of these, right? So that it can incorporate all the methods that are provided by all these four, right? So that is basically the difference in the new version and a major difference, right? So basically first we have seen the older version with this problem, and this problem is now solved with something called as list Crud repositories, right? So if I go here and instead of using Crud repository, if I use list Crud repository, now list Crud repository, then what will happen? Now here what we can do, instead of accepting iterable, we can just accept the list of applicants and just remove everything, right? So the overhead of converting that iterable is now removed. What we can do over here, we can directly just return it from here. Now all these codes is just came down to a single line because of this new repository, right? So if you go to find all now, you will see that it is returning list, and find all by ID is also returning a list. And this is basically list Crud repository, which is extending Crud repository as we have seen in this particular diagram, right? So that is basically how it looks now. And if you see paging and sorting repository now over here, if I go inside paging and sorting repository, then you will see that it is not extending Crud repository, rather it is extending repository, which is kind of a marker interface, right? And if I implement list paging and sorting over here, then let's see what happens. So let me just quickly import it and let's go inside it. We have only one method which is related to sort, right? It is not related to paging, right? So if you are using sort, then you can directly accept list, right? But if you are using paging, then you will need to take iterable only, as we are taking it over here, right? That is basically it. And why they need to do it? So if I show you real quick, then we have the Spring Data Commons release notes over here. So we have the Spring Data release notes, right? So if you see over here, then they are implementing something called as list Crud repositories, and they say that sorting repositories no longer inherit from Crud repositories, right? Loud and clear. You can also see that over here that paging and sorting repository no longer extends Crud repository, right? If in case we need to achieve the same behavior, then we must not only extend sorting repository but also extend Crud repository explicitly, right? So that means what they are trying to say over here is, if you want the same behavior, then go ahead and extends one more repository over here, which is Crud repository of applicant and long, right? So like that we need to do. After that, so if we do something like that over here, then we can use our paging and sorting repository to perform Crud operations as well. For example, let's say applicant paging and sorting repository dot save. Now it will have save methods, right? So that is how you need to achieve it if you want to achieve the older behavior, right? So the link of this release notes I will add in the description. You can go ahead and check this, right? So if I come back over here, so this is basically the new hierarchy, and that is basically the major difference now between paging and sorting repository. So this behavior also will be changed over here, because paging and sorting repository do not really support Crud operations anymore, right? So this block will be changed over here. So here it was supporting, but here it will not support. It will just support pagination and sorting, right? Nothing else, right? So that's about our two repositories, Crud repository, plus we have seen list Crud repositories as well. So I will just update this and add list Crud repository as well over here. So what I will do, I'll just paste this and say list Crud repository. Same with list paging and sorting repository, right? The only thing remaining now is JPA repository, and very important aspect now, right? So let's see, let's implement that now. Now let's go to our application and let's add a new interface, basically saying applicant JPA repository now, right? And it will just extend JPA repository, right? And here again we will say our applicant and long, which is the primary key of our applicant, right? And that's it again. Now let's make use of it in our service, right? So what I will do, I will just inject that as well explicitly over here. What I'll say, so I will say private applicant JPA repository, and I will simply auto-hire it, right? So that's basically injected, right? Now here, if I go inside JPA repository, then you will be able to see that it is extending list CRUD repository along with list paging and sorting repository, right? So that is basically what we have seen over here in this diagram, right? So it is basically extending both of them, right? And this guy was already supporting find all, right? So if in case you would have used JPA repository over here, then this problem that we have seen with CRUD repository was already solved in JPA repository, right? So JPA guy is already clever, right? So that is basically JPA repository. And if you see over here, we have these methods like flush, save and flush, save all and flush, and we have a few batch specific method: delete all in batch, delete all in batch, delete all by ID in batch, and delete all in batch. So apart from these methods of JPA, right, it will provide few other things as well, right? So this is common, right? This is very easy. You can simply implement it, right? But the point of highlight when we use JPA is your query methods, right? Query methods. Now what is query methods? Now let's say over here we have this applicant, right? Now in this applicant, let's say I want to find applicant by using status, right? Let's say I only want applicants which are active, right? Which are active. Or we can say I also want to check the list of inactive applicants over here, right? So what I need to do traditionally is I need to write a query for that, right? Because over here, if I do applicant JPARepository dot find by status, then I don't see any method like that, right? Find by ID might be there, but find by status is not there, right? That is when query methods comes into picture, right? So query method is something which comes in handy in such cases, right? So in that case, what you need to do is you just need to create a function. Let's say find by status. I want to find this particular applicant by status, right? And if I just add that, and let's say I will just pass a string status over here, right? And I will define a return type, right? So I will say I want the list of applicants, right? And that's it. Now I have added this method. So basically based on this naming convention that I want to find by status, right? What it will do, it will explicitly create a query and JPA will return us the output, right? I want to find by status. That means it is pretty clear that I want to find this applicant by status, right? And status is one of the field inside our applicant, right? So it will automatically create a query at its end, and I don't really need to add that particular query, right? So that is how this guy works, right? Let's say if I want to find by name and status as well, right? So I can simply modify that saying by name and by status. And that's it. And here I will just pass name as well. Now how simple is that, right? How simple is that? Now let's quickly see the example of one, right? So what I will do, I will just use this function somewhere. So let's go to our service, and what we can do, we can just create another get function. So what I will do, I will just add it over here, get applicant. I will say get applicant by status, right? And we'll just take a string status from user. And what we can do now, we can make use of JPA repository. So what I will do, applicant JPA repository dot find by status, and I will just simply pass this status, and that's it. Now let's quickly add endpoint to check that. So what I will do, I will just add another get endpoint, right? Another get endpoint I will add, and I will add kind of a mapping over here. We'll add mapping as get by status, right? This also I will modify get applicant by status. After that, I will just call get application by status, and we will need a request parameter as status. So I will just add that request parameter over here, which will be a string, and it will be a status, right? And same status we will pass over here, right? That's it. Now let me just quickly rerun this application. Let's see what happens, right? So let me just rerun it. Let it come up. It is started. So what I will do first, I will add some data inside our application. So I will add this guy Jolly Reddy is active, right? Let's add Konda Reddy as inactive because that guy is dead, right? So I will send it with the status as inactive, and let's say our Pushparaj is active, right? And let's add one more perhaps. So our Shrivalli also is active, right? Pushparaj and Shrivalli are basically very active. So I have added all these 4. So if I go back over here, or let me perhaps just create a new API over here, and params I will add status, and I want active status, right? And now if I send it, oh, I need to change the URL as well. So I will add what we have added over here, get by status, right? So let me just copy that and let me add it over here, and let's send it. So do you see over here? So Jolly Reddy, Pushpa and Shrivalli, these guys are active, right? And if you want to see who are inactive, then I can just change the status over here, and let's send it again. If you see over here, then Conda is basically inactive, right? So that's how basically your named methods will work, right? And this guy also supports sorting, right? Okay, so let me tell you that as well. If I go over here, go back to JPA repository, then I can also add something like sorting in what order I want to sort it, right? So for example, I want to sort these guys, right? So what I'll do, I'll use order by clause, right? We use order by clause in SQL, right? So I'll say order by name. Order by name, that means name of these guys, name of our guys. And what order I should give, let me give ascending, right? Let me give ascending at the moment. So if I go, let me just rerun this same application, right? So I need to call the new method now, right? So let me just rerun again, and again we need to add few folks, right? Because our application has been reloaded. So now if I hit this particular API again, let's see what happens. So if you see over here, then it is sorted based on names. We have Jolly first, then Pushpa, then Shrivalli, right? And if I pass inactive status over here, then let's see what happens. And as you can see, Bhavar Singh comes first and Konda Reddy comes second, right? That is basically name-based sorting that we are achieving over here, right? So that is how we can make use of query methods, right? That is basically query methods that we have over here. So lastly, let's see query annotations. So here we can use @query annotations as well, right? So let's say there is some use case that we have observed which cannot be fulfilled by query methods, right? For example, let's go back over here and let's try to implement functionality like find application by partial name, right? So let's say we have Konda Reddy, I'm just passing Reddy over here. But if I say find by name, then it will try to match the exact name, right? So here in this case, this will not work, right? This is not a query method format that we have. So in that case, what we can do, we can actually write a query on top of this guy, right? So here you can actually write SQL query, right? So how that query would look like, it would look like something like this, right? Let me just add it over here. So select A from applicant A, where A.name like, and what is this name? This name will be replaced by this name, right? And in order to replace that, we need to add something called as param. Here we need to define that, okay, this is my param is going to be, and the key of that param is basically the name, right? So this is basically it is going to be, right? So let's quickly implement a API by using this method, right? So what I will do, I'll go to service, I will add another get API over here. I'll say partial name, I'll accept name inside string. I will make use of the other method now, find by applicant's partial name, and I will just pass name over here, right? And I'll return it, right? Now in the controller, let's add another API by name, right? And here what I will do, I will say get applicant by partial name, and here in the request parameter, let's accept name, and here let's say get by partial name, and let's pass name to this guy, right? That should do it. Now let me just rerun this application, let's see what happens now. And I will go back over here, add few folks. So let me just add Bhavar space Singh now, right? So Singh spelling should be INGH, right? So now I will just add this guy, and I will just quickly duplicate this tab. What I will do, I will just modify this API according to this. So we have get by name over here, and what we need name in this case, right? So here instead of status, we need name, right? So here what we will do, we'll just say Singh, right? Now as you can see, we have got Bhavar Singh, right? So that is basically how you can use @query annotation, right? So this also we have seen now, right? So there are many things we have seen in this video, and we have seen all type of repositories over here as well, right? So I will push this project on a GitHub repository and I will add the link in the description. You can just clone and start playing around with this particular project, right? So that marks the end of this particular video, and that is basically Spring Data JPA for you, right? It's very, very easy framework, and anyone can just go ahead and start using it, right? Very, very easy. You just need to understand few fundamental concepts that we have understood in this video and last two videos, right? So if you like the video, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to Code Snippet. Share this video with your friends so that they are also aware of Spring Data JPA and the new version of Spring Data JPA, right? That is very, very important. That's it for this video. See you in the next video.